My name is Audrey Wilson, and at 34 years old, I have spent my life being underestimated. With my quiet voice and unassuming appearance, people rarely see me coming. My career as a federal financial crimes investigator surprises most who meet me socially. Last Thanksgiving at my brother James's house, my sister-in-law Pamela thought it would be funny to mock my profession in front of her wealthy family. She had no idea that her cruel joke would backfire so spectacularly when the doorbell rang. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and if this resonates with you, please hit the subscribe button. I always had a natural talent with numbers. While other kids struggled with math homework, I found patterns and connections effortlessly. My childhood bedroom walls weren't covered with pop stars, but with hand-drawn charts tracking my allowance investments. By 13, I was balancing my parents' checkbook. My high school guidance counselor suggested accounting as a natural fit, but I dreamed of something more impactful than corporate bookkeeping. When I graduated from university with dual degrees in accounting and criminal justice, many questioned my choice. Why combine these fields? My answer was simple. Money tells stories that people try to hide. My brother James was my biggest supporter through those years. For years younger than me. He had always looked up to me with a kind of awe that bolstered my confidence when others doubted my path. James and I grew up inseparable despite our age difference. We built blanket forts in the living room where I would read him stories about detectives and mysteries. As teenagers, he helped me prepare for exams, quizzing me for hours and celebrating every A I brought home. When our parents divorced during his freshman year of college, we leaned on each other more than ever. He understood my drive to make a difference in a way nobody else seemed to. After completing my master's degree, I spent 3 grueling years working my way up through entry-level positions at the Treasury Department before finally landing my dream role as a financial investigator. The work was demanding, but deeply satisfying. I built cases against money launderers, tax evaders, and corporate fraudsters. My colleagues respected my attention to detail and uncanny ability to spot irregularities in financial statements that others missed. James met Pamela Armstrong at a charity gala 5 years ago. She worked as a senior executive at Finance First Global, one of the largest investment firms on the East Coast. Their whirlwind romance moved quickly, and within 6 months, they were engaged. At their wedding, I gave a heartfelt toast about finding partners who bring out our best selves. Looking back, the irony is painful. From our first meeting, Pamela and I struggled to connect. She was everything I wasn't: tall, striking, loud, and commanding. She entered rooms with the expectation that all eyes would turn to her, and they usually did. Her designer wardrobe and perfect makeup contrasted sharply with my practical pantsuits and minimal cosmetics. But our differences went deeper than appearance. Pamela viewed success through the lens of salary and status. During our early conversations, she would ask about my government salary with barely concealed pity. The private sector would value your skills so much more, she would say, slipping business cards of recruiting friends into my purse. I tried explaining that my work gave me purpose beyond a paycheck, but she would smile indulgently as if I were deluding myself. Over the years, her subtle put-downs became a constant undercurrent in our relationship. When discussing vacation plans, she would comment that perhaps someday I could splurge on a real trip instead of my national park campgrounds. When I mentioned late nights building a case, she would sigh about how the government overworks its poor employees while she received performance bonuses for similar hours. James noticed the tension but felt caught in the middle. She means well, he would insist after particularly uncomfortable gatherings. She just shows affection differently than we do. I nodded and changed the subject, unwilling to force him to choose sides. 3 weeks before last Thanksgiving, I received the promotion I had been working toward for years: Senior Investigative Auditor. The position came with expanded authority to pursue complex financial crime networks and lead specialized teams. My supervisor praised my extraordinary attention to detail and unwavering ethical standards in the promotion letter. For the first time in my career, I felt my quiet approach to excellence was being recognized on its own terms. The promotion coincided with our annual Thanksgiving gathering at James and Pamela's suburban Boston home. Each year, the event grew more elaborate as Pamela's professional success translated into material upgrades. Their modest starter home had been replaced by a colonial revival with manicured gardens. The practical family sedan now shared garage space with Pamela's luxury convertible. Despite our strained relationship, I hoped my professional milestone might finally earn Pamela's respect. Perhaps she would see that success could look different from her definition, but still be meaningful. I spent the morning of Thanksgiving baking my grandmother's apple pie from scratch, carefully crimping the edges and cutting maple leaves from extra dough to decorate the top. The familiar ritual calmed my nerves as I prepared to face Pamela and her equally intimidating parents. I knew Richard and Margaret Armstrong from previous holiday gatherings. Richard had built a commercial real estate empire before semi-retiring to an advisory role that still kept him in circles of power and influence. Margaret managed their extensive charitable foundation with the same precision she applied to evaluating her daughter's friends and connections. They had always been cordial to me, but with a slightly distant politeness reserved for people they considered irrelevant to their social ecosystem. As I drove to James and Pamela's house, I rehearsed responses to the inevitable questions about my love life, non-existent due to work demands, and career trajectory, steady but unspectacular by their standards. I practiced genuine compliments for Pamela's recent charity fundraiser and reminded myself that family harmony was worth swallowing some pride. The sprawling houses of their neighborhood gleamed with early holiday decorations as I pulled into their circular driveway, balancing my pie carefully as I rang the doorbell. James answered the door with his familiar warm smile, pulling me into a bear hug that momentarily melted my anxiety. "The promotion girl is here," he announced, taking the pie from my hands. "I've been bragging about you all morning." My spirits lifted as I stepped into the foyer, where the scent of roasting turkey mingled with cinnamon and cloves. The momentary comfort evaporated when Pamela appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a designer apron that looked as though it had never seen a food stain. "Audrey, finally," she said, air kissing near my cheek. "Mom and Dad have been asking when you'd arrive." Her tone carried the implication that punctuality was among my many shortcomings, though I had arrived precisely at the requested time. Pamela's parents rose from the living room sofa, cocktails in hand. Margaret embraced me with the careful precision of someone concerned about transferring makeup. Richard offered a firm handshake and immediately launched into conversation with his daughter. "Pamela was just telling us about her department's record-breaking quarter," he said proudly. "The board is considering her for the CFO track next year." "Oh, that's just preliminary discussions." Pamela demurred, though her smile betrayed her certainty. She glanced at me. "Audrey got a promotion too. In government accounting." The way she emphasized the words made clear the hierarchy she perceived. "How nice," Margaret said with the same tone she might use to acknowledge a child's crayon drawing. "Is that with the IRS?" "No, I'm with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network," I explained. "We investigate complex financial fraud cases and coordinate with other agencies to build prosecutions." "Sounds tedious," Richard commented. "But I suppose someone has to do the paperwork." He turned back to Pamela, effectively dismissing me from the conversation. James caught my eye with an apologetic glance before steering me toward the kitchen. "Come help me with the appetizers. I need your expert arrangement skills." In the kitchen, Pamela had transformed the space into something worthy of a magazine spread. Copper pots hung from a ceiling rack, and specialized gadgets lined the marble countertops. A catering assistant I hadn't seen in previous years was arranging cheese on artisanal boards. "James mentioned you were promoted," the young woman said kindly. "Congratulations." Before I could respond, Pamela swept in. "Audrey, would you mind taking care of the water glasses? Make sure they're spotless." She turned to the assistant. "Jessica is studying at the Culinary Institute. She's helping with presentation this year." The assignment to water glass duty, while the catering student handled more visible tasks, wasn't subtle. I silently counted to 10 and began inspecting glasses, listening as Pamela directed Jessica on the exact placement of each cheese variety. James approached with a plate of olives. "Sorry," he whispered. "She's been stressed about impressing her parents. Apparently her dad's golf buddy's son just made partner at Goldman Sachs, and they haven't stopped talking about it for weeks." I nodded understandingly. James had always tried to mediate, and I didn't want to make his position more difficult. "The house looks beautiful," I offered as a peace gesture. The kitchen dynamic established the pattern for the next hour as more guests arrived. Pamela's brother Maxwell and his wife Charlotte came with their 7-year-old son Tyler. Pamela's college roommate Diana arrived with her husband Greg, both carrying gift bags of expensive wine. Each introduction included Pamela highlighting connections to prestigious institutions or impressive career achievements, while my introduction remained minimal. As we moved to the dining room, I noticed the strategic seating arrangement. Pamela had positioned herself at the center of one side with her parents flanking the ends of the table. James sat opposite her, with me placed at the furthest end next to Tyler. The message was clear. I was assigned to the children's section. "So, Audrey," Diana called from her premium position near Pamela. "James tells us you're not seeing anyone currently?" The conversation lull that followed her question made clear everyone was awaiting my response. "My work keeps me pretty busy," I said, reaching for my water glass. "Such a shame," Margaret interjected. "A woman your age really should prioritize before it's too late." "Not everyone needs the same timeline," James defended, passing the cranberry sauce my way. "But surely she must get lonely in that tiny apartment," Pamela added with false concern. "Government salaries just don't stretch very far in Boston." "My apartment suits me perfectly," I replied evenly. "And the security clearance process for my position is much easier when you live modestly." "Security clearance," Richard repeated with a hint of amusement. "For reviewing tax forms." Before I could correct him, Pamela smoothly changed the subject to their recent vacation in the Maldives. The conversation shifted to investment opportunities in emerging markets, deliberately technical and excluding me from participation. When I attempted to join the discussion about financial regulations, mentioning recent changes to reporting requirements, Pamela cut me off. "That's the problem with government oversight." She sighed to the table. "Always creating more paperwork without understanding how business actually functions." Beside me, young Tyler pushed his peas around his plate, clearly bored by the adult conversation. I sketched a quick tic-tac-toe grid on my napkin and slid it toward him with a wink. His face brightened as we began a silent game. Pamela noticed our interaction and frowned. "Tyler, don't bother your aunt with games at the table. She works with important numbers all day." "What do you do?" Tyler asked me directly, ignoring his aunt's attempt to end our interaction. I smiled, grateful for his genuine interest. "I help catch people who try to trick others with money." "Like a money detective?" His eyes widened with interest. "Sort of," I began, but Pamela interrupted with a laugh. "Auntie Audrey just checks boring numbers all day," she told him. "Like a teacher checking homework. But for grown-ups." Tyler's interest visibly deflated, and he returned to pushing food around his plate. The deliberate diminishment of my work in the child's eyes stung more than previous jabs. Children see the world with such clarity before adults teach them to assign arbitrary value to different types of contribution. James caught my eye from across the table, his expression troubled. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he refilled my wine glass with a subtle gesture of solidarity. I appreciated the effort. But his silence in the face of Pamela's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As the main course was cleared and the conversation turned to professional accomplishments around the table, I felt myself withdrawing further. Greg described his recent promotion at a tech startup, and Charlotte shared updates about her interior design business expanding to include commercial clients. Each announcement was met with enthusiastic questions and congratulations from Pamela and her parents. "Our biggest news, of course," Pamela said, gesturing with her wine glass, "is the innovative client protection program my division launched last quarter. We've developed a proprietary method for structuring investments that shields assets from market volatility while maintaining liquidity access." My professional radar immediately activated. The vague description contained several phrases I had seen in recent securities fraud cases. Asset protection with guaranteed liquidity typically involved misleading clients about risk levels or creating shell entities to move money through. That sounds interesting, I said carefully. How do you manage the reporting requirements for non-standard investment vehicles? Pamela's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. We have an excellent compliance team that handles all the bureaucratic details. Pamela's division has doubled their client portfolio in just 18 months, Richard announced proudly, breaking company records left and right. Rapid growth can sometimes create compliance challenges, I observed neutrally, especially with new financial products. That's why the private sector pays real money for talent, Pamela countered. We solve problems instead of creating regulatory roadblocks. The conversation pattern repeated with increasing tension. Each time I asked a substantive question about Finance First's practices, Pamela would deflect with jargon or redirect to another topic. Her father watched this dance with growing annoyance. What exactly do you do in your government job, Audrey? He finally asked in a tone that suggested he was setting up a point rather than seeking information. I was recently promoted to senior investigative auditor, I explained, seeing an opening to finally share my achievement. I lead specialized teams investigating financial crime patterns across multiple institutions. Government workers are so cute with their titles. Pamela interrupted with a laugh. They hand out impressive-sounding promotions instead of actual raises. My work is actually quite substantive, I continued, determined to finish. We identify sophisticated fraud schemes that harm investors and undermine market integrity. I'm sure it's very noble, Margaret said dismissively. But surely after all these years counting other people's money, you must wonder what it would be like to actually make some of your own? Audrey's work is important, James interjected, his voice firmer than before. She's helped build cases against some serious financial criminals. Oh, I'm sure she files very thorough reports, Pamela said, patting his hand condescendingly. But let's be honest, the real financial innovation happens in the private sector. Government workers just try to keep up with what we create. As the conversation continued, I became increasingly uncomfortable, but for reasons beyond Pamela's insults. Her casual description of Finance First's newest investment products contained alarming similarities to a case file I had reviewed just last week. The coincidence was too specific to ignore. Case number FIN 2857 had appeared on our department's watch list after multiple suspicious activity reports from partner banks. The investigation was preliminary, focused on unusual transaction patterns at a major investment firm. The file had noted specifically that the suspicious activities centered around a new asset protection program in the firm's Northeast division. Pamela was the Executive Vice President of Client Services for Finance First Global's Northeast Division. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. My sister-in-law's department wasn't just on our radar, it was potentially the subject of an active fraud investigation. I suddenly recalled additional details from the briefing. Accelerated client acquisition, unusual transaction structuring, multiple shell companies with circular ownership patterns. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Professional ethics required me to maintain absolute confidentiality about ongoing investigations. Family loyalty urged me to find some way to warn James about potential trouble ahead. Legal obligations demanded I recuse myself from any case involving relatives, but I couldn't do that without explaining why. The safest course was to remain silent until I could verify whether the Finance First investigation specifically involved Pamela's division. Perhaps the similarities were coincidental, or perhaps the preliminary reports had misidentified the source of suspicious activities. As I worked through this ethical minefield internally, Pamela mistook my silence for defeat. Her comments grew bolder, clearly enjoying what she perceived as another social victory over her awkward sister-in-law. The difference between government workers and private sector leaders, she announced to the table, is that we create value while they just create paperwork. The other guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the conversation had moved beyond good-natured ribbing into something more pointed. Even Richard and Margaret exchanged a glance that suggested their daughter might be taking things too far. I maintained my composure outwardly while my mind continued processing the horrifying possibility that tomorrow I might need to recuse myself from a major fraud investigation involving my own family. The Thanksgiving meal that I had approached with cautious optimism had transformed into a professional and personal nightmare. Jessica and the catering assistant returned to clear the dinner plates and prepare for dessert. The momentary interruption provided welcome relief from Pamela's increasingly hostile commentary. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. In the powder room, I splashed cold water on my face and took several deep breaths. The mirror reflected my flushed cheeks and tense expression. I had faced hostile witnesses and uncooperative financial institutions without losing my professional demeanor. I could certainly handle one more hour of Pamela's insults before making a graceful exit. When I returned to the dining room, Jessica was placing my homemade apple pie next to an elaborate store-bought tiramisu that Pamela announced had been specially ordered from an award-winning Italian bakery. The contrast between my humble offering and the professional dessert seemed to delight Pamela, who made a show of describing the bakery's celebrity clientele. "We should save Audrey's pie for tomorrow," she suggested with a thin smile. "After everyone's had a chance to enjoy the tiramisu." "I'd actually like to try Audrey's pie," James said firmly. Grandma Wilson's recipe was always my favorite part of Thanksgiving. Pamela's expression flickered with annoyance before she recovered. "Of course, darling. How thoughtless of me." She instructed Jessica to serve both desserts simultaneously. As champagne flutes were distributed for a Thanksgiving toast, I noticed Pamela whispering something to her father that made him glance in my direction with newfound interest. Whatever she had said, it had changed the dynamic yet again. Pamela stood, raising her champagne flute with practiced elegance. "Before we enjoy these wonderful desserts, I'd like to propose a toast to family and gratitude." Her voice had shifted into what I recognized as her public speaking tone, polished and performative. "Thanksgiving is about appreciating what we have and those around us," she continued. "I'm grateful for this beautiful home, my successful career, and my wonderful husband." She smiled down at James, who returned the gesture automatically. "I'm even grateful for the less conventional successes represented at our table," she continued, her gaze sliding meaningfully to me. "In a world that measures achievement through innovation and financial rewards, it's humbling to remember those who choose different paths." The room grew uncomfortably quiet as everyone sensed the shift from genuine gratitude to something more pointed. James straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "Take my sister-in-law, for example," Pamela continued, raising her glass slightly in my direction. "She's just a simple accountant working for the government, reviewing paperwork and following rules created by others." The deliberate emphasis on simple hung in the air. Richard chuckled appreciatively while Margaret maintained a polite smile. The other guests looked anywhere but at me, embarrassment evident in their postures. "It reminds us that not everyone needs to aim for excellence," Pamela continued, warming to her theme. "Some people are content to remain in the shallow end of the professional pool, watching while others dive into deeper waters." Tyler looked confused by the sudden tension, while his parents exchanged uncomfortable glances. Diana studied her champagne glass with intense focus. "To those who count beans and those who make the beans worth counting," Pamela concluded with a triumphant smile, clearly pleased with what she perceived as a clever closing line. A few nervous laughs broke the silence, followed by the awkward clinking of glasses. James opened his mouth, clearly preparing to object, but Pamela smoothly continued speaking, effectively cutting him off. "And of course, to simple pleasures like homemade pie," she added, nodding condescendingly toward my contribution. My face burned with humiliation as the full impact of her toast registered. She had deliberately, publicly framed my entire professional identity as insignificant and simplistic. Years of education, dedication, and meaningful work reduced to bean counting for the amusement of her audience. My hands trembled slightly as I set down my untouched champagne. The familiar physical symptoms of extreme stress registered distantly: elevated heartbeat, constricted breathing. the prickly warmth of blood rushing to my face. Part of me wanted to stand and defend my work, to challenge her assumptions about value and contribution. Another part recognized that engaging would only validate her framing of me as emotional and unprofessional. As I debated my response, the doorbell rang with unexpected timing. Pamela frowned, irritated by the interruption of her moment of triumph. Who could that be? Margaret wondered aloud, grateful for the distraction. Probably carolers starting early this year. Pamela suggested dismissively. James, would you check? James pushed back from the table with visible relief and disappeared into the foyer. We heard the front door open, followed by a brief, muffled conversation. Something about the visitor's voice triggered a memory, but I couldn't immediately place it. Pamela, unwilling to relinquish her position as the center of attention, raised her glass again. As I was saying, we should appreciate all contributions, however modest. Her words trailed off as James returned to the dining room, accompanied by a tall man in a charcoal suit whom I instantly recognized as Mark Stevenson, my department colleague. My confusion lasted only seconds before cold realization dawned. Mark was carrying the distinctive blue folder we used for priority audit documentation. Sorry to interrupt your Thanksgiving, Mark said, nodding politely to the table before turning to me. Audrey, I need your signature on these warrants for tomorrow's audit at Finance First. The judge approved them an hour ago, and we're set for an 8 a.m. entry. The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye at the table swiveled from Mark to me, then to Pamela, whose champagne glass remained frozen halfway to her lips. I don't understand, she said finally, her voice unnaturally high. What audit? Mark, who had apparently overheard Pamela's simple accountant toast as he approached the dining room, smiled thinly. Simple? MS. Wilson is the federal auditor scheduled to investigate your company tomorrow. She's the lead investigator on one of our most significant financial fraud cases this year. With mechanical precision, I reached into my purse and removed my federal credentials, placing them on the table beside my pie. The gold badge caught the light from the chandelier, suddenly the brightest object in the room. I was planning to recuse myself first thing in the morning, I said quietly, given the obvious conflict of interest. Pamela's face had drained of all color, the champagne in her hand now visibly trembling. The dramatic revelation hung in the air as I calmly took the blue folder from Mark. Opening it revealed the detailed audit authorization for Finance First Global, with particular focus on the Client Asset Protection Program launched by the Northeast Division. Pamela's division. Let me review these quickly, I said professionally, scanning the documents with practiced efficiency. The warrant authorized a comprehensive examination of all financial records, digital communications, and transaction histories related to the new investment program. Everything appears in order, I confirmed, signing the necessary forms. Though, as I mentioned, I'll need to file recusal paperwork immediately given my family connection to an executive in the targeted division. Mark nodded understandingly. I anticipated that possibility. The secondary team lead has already been briefed and can take over primary authority. Secondary team? Pamela finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Ms. Armstrong. Mark replied formally. For an investigation of this scale, we typically deploy multiple specialized units simultaneously. The audit team consists of 17 financial investigators and forensic accountants, plus technical support staff. But what exactly are you looking for? She demanded, her composure cracking further. This is completely unnecessary. Our compliance department handles all regulatory requirements. I maintained strict professionalism despite the personal context. I'm afraid I can't discuss specifics of an active investigation, especially given my need to recuse myself. Mark can coordinate with your legal department regarding the scope of tomorrow's audit. Richard Armstrong, who had been uncharacteristically silent since Mark's arrival, finally spoke. This sounds like bureaucratic overreach. I have contacts at the Treasury Department who will want to hear about this harassment. Your concerns are noted, sir, Mark replied evenly. But this investigation has been authorized at the highest levels following multiple suspicious activity reports from partner financial institutions. Any attempt to interfere with federal investigators would, of course, constitute a separate offense. The power dynamic in the room had undergone a seismic shift. The family members who had been smirking at Pamela's toast now looked at me with new eyes, reassessing everything they thought they knew about the simple accountant in their midst. Audrey has been one of our department's most effective investigators for years, Mark added, seemingly enjoying the opportunity to correct the record. Her recent promotion to senior investigative auditor was based on her exceptional record of identifying sophisticated fraud schemes that other analysts missed. Pamela's attempt to regain control was painful to watch. Audrey, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Whatever reports you've received are probably accounting errors that our team can easily explain. Her tone had transformed from condescending to desperately accommodating. You know how these things get blown out of proportion. As I said, I'll be recusing myself, I repeated firmly. But the investigation will proceed as scheduled. The other dinner guests now regarded me with expressions ranging from shock to newfound respect. Tyler's parents whispered urgently to each other. Diana and Greg exchanged meaningful glances. Even Margaret Armstrong studied me with recalculated interest. I should probably leave now to prepare for tomorrow, I said, standing and gathering my purse. Thank you for dinner, James. The turkey was excellent. I'll walk you out, James said quickly, his expression a complex mixture of confusion, apology, and pride. As we moved toward the foyer with Mark, the dining room erupted into urgent whispered conversations behind us. Pamela remained frozen in her seat, champagne glass still in hand, staring blankly at the federal badge I had deliberately left on the table beside my half-eaten pie. At the front door, James pulled me into a tight hug. I had no idea, he murmured. About your promotion or about Pamela's company being investigated. I couldn't tell you about the investigation, I explained quietly. And to be honest, your wife's attitude about my career didn't exactly encourage sharing good news. He winced, acknowledging the truth. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you more in there. Pamela can be challenging. But I've never seen her quite that deliberately cruel before. We'll talk more later, I promised, aware of Mark waiting discreetly by his government-issued sedan. This is going to be complicated for all of us. I'm proud of you, Audrey, James said earnestly. Always have been. The simple statement almost undid my carefully maintained composure. Despite the professional vindication, the evening had been emotionally exhausting. Thanks, James. That means a lot. As Mark drove me home, I stared out the window at the festive decorations illuminating the upscale neighborhood. The satisfaction of seeing Pamela's shock was already fading, replaced by concern about the complex personal and professional challenges ahead. Sorry to crash your family dinner, Mark said, breaking the silence. When I saw the address on your emergency contact form, I didn't immediately connect it to the Finance First case. Only realized it might be an issue when I was almost at the door. It's probably better this way, I admitted. Finding out at dinner rather than being blindsided at tomorrow's audit. Back at my apartment, I immediately called my supervisor to explain the situation. She agreed that my recusal was necessary and approved the secondary team lead taking over. After the call, I pulled out the case file I had been avoiding thinking about directly during dinner. The preliminary evidence against Finance First was substantial, unusual transaction patterns. Client funds moved through multiple shell companies, promotional materials that appeared to promise guaranteed returns without adequate risk disclosures. The suspicious activity had been concentrated in the Northeast Division's newest investment product line, the very program Pamela had been boasting about at dinner. I sat at my kitchen table reviewing the file until well past midnight, carefully documenting everything I knew about Pamela's role and our family connection. Professional ethics demanded absolute transparency and impartiality. Whatever was happening at Finance First would be investigated thoroughly, regardless of how it might affect my relationship with my brother. As I finally prepared for bed, my phone displayed multiple missed calls from James and a single text message, "Need to talk. This is bigger than you know." I left the message unanswered. Tomorrow would be complicated enough without additional family entanglements tonight. Instead, I laid out my most professional suit and briefcase for the morning, preparing to face whatever consequences awaited. I arrived at the Finance First Global headquarters at precisely 7:30 the next morning. The gleaming 50-story tower dominated the downtown skyline, its reflective glass exterior capturing the early morning sunlight. The building projected exactly the image the company cultivated: modern, imposing, and impenetrable. Mark had assembled the investigative team in a hotel conference room 2 blocks away for a pre-audit briefing. I attended only long enough to formally transfer authority to Deputy Investigator Claire Bennett and provide the signed recusal documentation. Claire was one of our department's most experienced investigators, with a reputation for uncompromising thoroughness. "I've reviewed your preliminary findings," Claire assured me. "We'll be extremely thorough, especially given the sensitive nature of your recusal." At 7:55, I accompanied the team to the building lobby. Not as a participating investigator, but to ensure a smooth handoff before departing. The team of 17 federal agents in professional attire attracted immediate attention from security personnel, who frantically called upstairs as Claire presented the audit warrant. We were directed to wait in the marble-floored reception area beneath the massive Finance First logo. Executive staff began arriving hurriedly through private elevators, summoned by urgent early morning calls. The company's chief legal officer appeared first, followed by the compliance director and several senior executives I didn't recognize. And then Pamela emerged from an elevator, looking as though she hadn't slept. Her designer suit was impeccably pressed, but her complexion was ashen, and her typically perfect makeup couldn't fully conceal the dark circles under her eyes. When she spotted me among the federal agents, she stopped short, momentarily frozen in disbelief. "Audrey," she managed, her voice strained. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm only here for the initial handoff," I explained professionally. "I've recused myself from the investigation due to our family connection. Deputy Investigator Bennett will be leading the audit." Claire stepped forward with brisk efficiency. "Ms. Armstrong will need immediate access to all records related to the Client Asset Protection Program, including client communications, transaction histories, and internal approval documentation." Pamela's eyes never left my face. "Could we speak privately for a moment, Audrey? As family?" "I'm afraid that would be inappropriate given the circumstances," I replied evenly. "Any communication regarding the investigation should go through proper channels." The company executives were escorted to a large conference room while the federal team began setting up in various departments. I prepared to leave, having completed my official role in the process, when the company's CEO Robert Caldwell approached me directly. "Ms. Wilson, I understand you're related to Pamela Armstrong," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "And that you've recused yourself from our audit." "That's correct, sir." "I appreciate your professionalism," he continued. "But perhaps you could give me some insight into exactly what prompted this investigation? We pride ourselves on regulatory compliance." The investigation was initiated following multiple suspicious activity reports from partner financial institutions, I explained, providing only information that would be in the warrant documentation. Beyond that, I cannot and will not discuss details of an active case. As I turned to leave, Pamela broke away from the legal team and intercepted me near the elevators. Her carefully maintained professional mask had slipped, revealing naked panic beneath. "You can't do this to me," she hissed, low enough that others couldn't hear. "Do you have any idea what this will do to my career?" "To James? I didn't initiate this investigation to target you, Pamela," I replied calmly. The suspicious activity reports came through standard channels, and I was already planning to recuse myself. "After humiliating me in front of my family," she snapped. "That wasn't my choice or my timing. And if we're discussing humiliation, perhaps you should reflect on your Thanksgiving toast." Her expression hardened. "Is that what this is about? Revenge for a few harmless jokes?" "This investigation has nothing to do with personal feelings," I stated firmly. "It's about potential securities violations that harmed investors. If your department has nothing to hide, the audit will confirm that." Pamela glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard before leaning closer. We can work this out, Audrey. We're family. There are ways to make problems like this disappear that benefit everyone involved. The implication was unmistakable, and my blood ran cold. Are you suggesting I interfere with a federal investigation? I'm suggesting we find a mutually beneficial resolution, she replied, her voice dropping further. My division manages several $100 million in assets. Redirecting even a small percentage could change your life completely. No more budget department or government salary. I stepped back, creating physical distance between us. What you're describing is a criminal offense. I recommend you speak with legal counsel immediately and avoid making similar suggestions to anyone else. Her desperation visibly increased. Think about what this will do to James. When this becomes public, everyone will assume he knew something. His consulting clients will drop him overnight. The manipulation attempt was almost pathetically transparent. I'm not the one who put James in this position, Pamela. If there are securities violations in your division, that responsibility lies with the people who committed them. You self-righteous bitch, she whispered, finally dropping all pretense. You've always been jealous of my success. This is your chance to tear me down, isn't it? Rather than responding to her accusation, I reached into my pocket and removed my government-issued phone. This conversation is being recorded as a potential attempt to obstruct justice and bribe a federal official. I strongly advise you to step back and contact your attorney. Pamela's face contorted with shock as she realized the full implications of her actions. She backed away without another word, nearly stumbling in her haste to rejoin the legal team. I reported the interaction to Claire immediately, providing the recording and a written statement. The attempted bribe would become part of a separate obstruction investigation, further complicating the already complex case. By mid-afternoon, preliminary findings had confirmed many of our initial concerns. The audit team discovered evidence suggesting Pamela's division had been operating a sophisticated scheme to conceal investment losses while continuing to report positive returns to clients. When Claire called to update me, her typically measured tone couldn't hide her amazement at the scale of the fraud. We've only scratched the surface, she reported. But we're already seeing evidence of falsified performance reports, circular transactions through shell companies, and misappropriation of client funds. Your sister-in-law's electronic signature appears on numerous suspicious authorization forms. The news landed like a physical blow despite my professional detachment. Make sure everything is documented with absolute precision, I instructed. Given my recusal, this case will face extra scrutiny. Already handling it that way, Claire assured me. But there's something else you should know. We found communications suggesting knowledge of the scheme extended beyond the Northeast Division. The CEO has been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Later that evening, the department issued a press release announcing the investigation into Finance First Global. Careful to note that findings were preliminary and charges had not yet been filed. Financial news outlets immediately began speculating about potential securities fraud at one of the nation's largest investment firms. As I watched the coverage from my apartment, my phone rang. James's name appeared on the screen, and I finally answered after several rings. Pamela's been suspended, he said without preamble, his voice hollow with shock. The board called an emergency meeting and placed her entire division under administrative review. I'm sorry, James, I said, and meant it. Whatever Pamela had done. My brother was collateral damage. Did you know? He asked, the question I had been dreading. Before Thanksgiving, I mean. Was this why you were asking those questions at dinner? I knew there was an investigation into Finance First, I admitted. But I didn't know it specifically involved Pamela's division until some of the details she mentioned at dinner matched our case file. That's why I was planning to recuse myself. His long silence spoke volumes. She's saying she did nothing wrong, he finally continued. That this is a witch hunt by jealous competitors or overzealous regulators. The evidence will speak for itself, I replied carefully. But James, she tried to bribe me this morning. Suggested that client funds could be redirected to benefit both of us if I helped make the investigation disappear. His sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't known about that attempt. Jesus. Audrey. What happens now? The investigation continues. If sufficient evidence is found, there will be charges, possibly against multiple executives, including Pamela. I can't be involved in any of it because of our relationship. And us? He asked quietly. What happens to us? The question broke my heart. That's up to you, James. I love you. And you'll always be my brother. But I had to do my job. I know, he said after another long pause. I just need some time to process all this. We ended the call with an uncomfortable formality that had never existed between us before. The professional satisfaction of uncovering fraud was thoroughly overshadowed by the personal cost to my closest family relationship. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded dramatically. Additional federal agencies joined the case as evidence suggested the fraud extended beyond securities violations into potential money laundering and tax evasion. Pamela and 3 other executives were formally placed on administrative leave, and the company's stock price plummeted as investors panicked. I maintained strict separation from the case, focusing on other investigations while receiving only the most basic updates that would be available to any department member. Each development made headlines in financial publications, creating a surreal experience of following my family's unfolding crisis through news alerts on my phone. James and I exchanged only brief, factual text messages during this period. He had moved temporarily to a hotel after Pamela's suspension, needing space to evaluate his own knowledge or ignorance of her activities. When he finally called again, his voice sounded older, weighted with new understanding. We need to talk, he said simply. All 3 of us. The mediated meeting took place in a neutral conference room at the offices of Pamela's defense attorney. James had arranged the discussion not as part of the legal proceedings, but as an attempt to address the personal devastation that had accompanied the professional collapse. I arrived first, choosing a seat that allowed me to see both the door and the windows overlooking the city. The attorney had agreed to give us privacy for this family conversation, but waited in an adjoining room in case legal counsel became necessary. Pamela entered with James, her appearance dramatically different from the polished executive I had known. Her designer wardrobe had been replaced by a simple gray suit, her elaborate hairstyle now a practical bob. The most striking change was in her demeanor. The commanding presence had collapsed into itself, leaving a diminished figure who avoided direct eye contact. James looked exhausted but resolute as he took the seat between us. Thank you both for agreeing to this, he began awkwardly. I think we need to clear the air if we're going to move forward in any capacity. Pamela stared at her folded hands. My attorney advised against this meeting. This isn't about the case. James clarified. It's about us as people, as family. The uncomfortable silence that followed seemed to physically occupy the room until I finally spoke. I want you both to know that I never targeted finance first because of our relationship. The investigation was already underway before I realized Pamela's division was involved. Convenient timing. Though, Pamela muttered, a shadow of her former sharpness attempting to reassert itself. James shook his head firmly. That's exactly the kind of response that doesn't help, Pam. We agreed to honesty today. She exhaled slowly, composing herself with visible effort. Fine. The internal investigation confirmed what your federal friends found. I signed off on reports I knew contained misrepresentations. I helped structure the program to conceal losses. I did those things. The admission, though expected given the mounting evidence, still shocked me with its directness. Why? James asked, the simple question carrying the weight of his shattered trust. Because success was the only acceptable outcome, she replied, her voice hollow. My entire identity was built around being exceptional, the best, always winning. When the initial investment strategy failed, fixing the numbers seemed easier than admitting failure. She finally looked directly at me. I resented you because you seemed content with what I considered mediocrity. A small apartment, modest salary, limited recognition. But you were doing work you believed in, while I was destroying myself and others to maintain an illusion. The acknowledgement, however painful its delivery, represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected from her. The irony, I noted quietly, is that my supposedly modest government position ultimately had more impact than your executive title. I'm facing federal charges, Pamela said flatly. Possibly prison time, though my cooperation may reduce the sentence. Everything I built is gone. My reputation is destroyed. And many of your clients lost their savings, I added, unwilling to let the consequences to others go unacknowledged. She flinched but nodded. Yes, that's the worst part, actually. People trusted me with their futures. James reached for her hand tentatively. Pamela's been meeting with a therapist to address the underlying issues. The competitive drive that pushed her to these decisions didn't develop overnight. My parents measured love and achievements, she explained, not as an excuse but as context. Second place might as well have been last place in our home. I internalized that completely. And the way you treated me at family gatherings? I asked, needing to address the personal dynamic that had preceded the professional collision. I felt threatened by you, she admitted, the words seemingly painful to vocalize. Your quiet confidence. Your brother's obvious respect for you. I needed to diminish you to feel secure. It was cruel and childish, and I'm sorry. The apology, though long overdue, carried the weight of her current circumstances. Apologizing from a position of complete vulnerability required a different kind of courage than I had previously associated with Pamela. I appreciate that, I said carefully. And I'm sorry that my professional obligations caused such personal devastation for both of you. If there had been any other ethical path available, I would have taken it. You did your job, James affirmed. And from what I've learned since, that job protected countless people from further harm. I'm proud of you for that. Even through all this mess, we talked for another hour, addressing years of tension and the uncertain path ahead. There were no magical resolutions or complete healing, but there was truth where deception had flourished and possibility where only destruction had seemed inevitable. As we prepared to leave, Pamela paused at the door. The prosecutor mentioned that your recusal documentation was extraordinarily detailed and transparent. She said most people would have cut corners given the personal complications, but your ethical standards were exceptional. A faint smile touched her lips. Not so simple after all. 6 months later, much had changed. Pamela had accepted a plea agreement that included significant financial penalties and a suspended sentence contingent on continued cooperation with authorities. She had enrolled in ethics courses at a local university and begun speaking to business students about the slippery slope from aggressive accounting to criminal fraud. James and Pamela separated legally, but maintained contact through counseling, their future together uncertain, but not entirely foreclosed. My brother had rebuilt his consulting practice with a new emphasis on ethical business practices, turning his personal experience into a cautionary perspective for clients. My department received commendation for the finance-first investigation, which ultimately recovered millions in misappropriated client funds. My handling of the recusal process became a case study in professional ethics training. The simple accountant had helped expose one of the largest financial fraud cases of the year. On a crisp autumn evening almost a year after that fateful Thanksgiving, James and I met for coffee at a small cafe halfway between our apartments. The familiar comfort of his company had gradually returned, though shaped by the shared experience of the past year. Pamela finished her first semester of ethics courses, he mentioned, stirring his latte. Top of the class, naturally. I smiled at the characteristic competitiveness that even disgrace hadn't completely erased. Some habits die hard, I guess. She asked about you. He continued. Wondered if someday you might be willing to talk again. No pressure either way. I considered the possibility, weighing the complicated history against the potential for genuine change. Maybe someday. Not quite yet. He nodded understandingly. For what it's worth. I think you taught her more about integrity in one night than all those university courses combined. As we talked, I reflected on the strange journey from that humiliating Thanksgiving toast to the professional and personal aftermath. The quiet path I had chosen, seemingly less impressive than Pamela's meteoric rise, had ultimately proven more sustainable and meaningful. True success, I had realized, wasn't measured in salary figures or job titles, but in the integrity with which we approached our work and relationships. The simple accountant, labeled Pamela, had intended as an insult had been reclaimed as a badge of honor. Simplicity, in the sense of straightforward ethics and authentic purpose, was actually the more challenging and rewarding path. Perhaps the most valuable lesson was recognizing that the quietest person in the room is often the one you should watch most carefully. Not because they're plotting or scheming, but because their silence frequently contains deeper thought and more careful observation than others' constant noise. I've learned that our worth isn't determined by others' assessments or comparisons. The validation that matters comes from within, from knowing that our choices align with our values. No toast, no matter how cleverly crafted or cruelly delivered, can diminish the satisfaction of living and working with integrity. Have you ever been underestimated because of your quiet nature or humble approach? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful response to being underestimated is simply proving your worth through your actions rather than your words. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more experiences about finding strength in unexpected moments. Thank you for listening. And remember that true character reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in times of challenge.